We'll be starting the session now.
Hello, Vasanthi.
Hi.
Good evening, friends of HLF. On behalf of my colleagues, as well as myself at the Hyderabad Literary Festival, and on behalf of Team Orient Black Swan, I extend a very warm welcome to all of you to our fortnightly Fridays online sessions. It is a pleasure to have Professor Vasanthi Srinivasan today with us with her book, Virtue and Human Ends, Political Ideas from Indian Classics. I will be talking to her with asking her a lot of questions on my own behalf, but later on, I would like to ask a lot of your questions. So please type away your questions in the chat box. Our speaker today, Vasanthi Srinivasan, is a professor of political science at the University of Hyderabad. She has authored 2 other books, Gandhi's Conscience Keeper, C. Rajagopalachari and Indian Politics in 2009, and Hindu Spirituality and Virtue Politics in 2014. Virtue and Human Ends, Political Ideas from Indian Classics has been published this year by Orient Black Swan. Vasanthi received her PhD in political science from Carleton University, Ottawa. She previously taught also at the College of Humanities, Ottawa. She has been a Commonwealth and New India Foundation scholar. She has been a visiting scholar at CASI University of Pennsylvania in April 2009 and SAAS Yale University April 2011 and at CPS JNU 2012. Her research interests are in the areas of Indian political ideas, comparative political thought, and the interface between technology and politics. Her latest work titled Virtue and Human Ends, Political Ideas from Indian Classics delves into the Panchatantra, Hitopadesha, and other literary texts. This is the book. Vasanthi, may I request you to please hold up the book for our viewers? Yeah. This is a compact book and a beautiful and delightful cover.
I know.
A few words about the book, more for introducing it to our viewers, Vasanthi, and then I would like you to elaborate the same in more detail a little later. This book is an analysis and critique of the classical tales of India in regard to political thought, policy, ethics, and virtue, with which we all grew up with, actually, and as stories in textbooks or narrated at home or in comic book form. But these are not mere stories, and Vasanthi's book addresses the larger context of these narratives. The texts in discussion are Panchatantra, Hitopadesha, Dasakumara Charita, and Vetala Panchavimshati in the main, and Arthashastra and Mudra Rakshasa in the background. This book consists of 5 key chapters sandwiched between a lucid introduction and a concluding argument. Beginning with a discussion of studying politics versus doing politics, the book goes on to talk about discerning friends and enemies and prudence in Panchatantra, dangerous remedies and real success while discussing war and peace in Hitopadesha, love and politics, gambles and strife in Dasakumara Charita, and ends with ethical excellence issues in Vetala Panchavimshati. The book is of interest not only to literature enthusiasts and students of political thought, but also to the larger public interest in the art of larger public interested in the fantastic art of storytelling. Indeed, as the author says in her introduction, and I quote her, a multidisciplinary approach to liberal arts is the need of the day to enable holistic cultivation of the intellectual, aesthetic, social, physical, emotional, and moral capabilities of students. She refers to the new education policy that lists many virtues such as commitment to liberal notions of freedom and equality, inclusivity, tolerance, diversity, and so on. She therefore opines that more than preaching a standard table of virtues, a liberal arts education must endeavor to cultivate the mind and heart so that a student, or if I may add here, Readers in general may reflect on their own interests and desires, life plans and choices, and learn to steer away from extremes. And I think this is very topical in today's context. This book is embedded in this desire to give critique on the ancient texts in a way that will enable us to think alternate narratives and situational choices with more depth. I now request Vasanthi to elaborate on her premises for the book a little more.
Thank you, Kinnera, for that wonderful introduction to me and to the book. I'm delighted to be here. I want to begin by thanking HLF, Kinnera, the team at HLF, Uma, who took the initiative, as well as the Orient Black Swan team for co-organizing this event. Greetings to one and all in the audience. As things go, I would like to actually read parts of the book, even as I steer you all through the themes that have driven the analysis in this book. After all, the study of politics evokes derision and laughter as a waste of time and resources. Politics, which is only about opportunism and expediency, is best left to politicians who do not study politics, let alone teach it. And yet, I found in many of these texts that Kinnera just mentioned, there were great paeans to the study of Rajniti or Dandaniti or Rajadharma or Naya Shastra or Niti Shastra, as the study of politics is referred to. And there is an extraordinary kind of paean that comes up in Dasakumara Charita, from which I want to read for you. This is an old courtier who is trying to convince a very, very accomplished ruler called Anantavarman, who is already adept in poetics and certain other fine arts. And he tells him, "Your Majesty, you have every excellence, but unluckily, you are not well versed in the Arthashastra." He goes on to say, when the path of action is seen by the lamp of political science, Niti Shastra, the course of worldly affairs proceeds smoothly on. The science of politics is but the divine eye, the operation of which is never obstructed in giving insight into things past, present, and future, as well as hidden or far removed from sight. Devoid of that eye or the lamp, a man, although having large eyes, is no better than a blind creature owing to his inability to penetrate into means and ends. Abandon, therefore, the attachment to mere external accomplishments and study the science of Dandaniti, your family inheritance. But this, of course, falls on deaf ears because the king has a very sophisticated courtier called Viharabhadra, who immediately decides to dissuade the king from any such endeavor to study Rajniti. Here is Viharabhadra parodying the 6,000 stanzas of Vishnugupta and telling us how the study of politics is exactly that, a waste of time and resources. He says a king would just grow old reading and hearing it, since we are told, and he would be told by other courtiers, that Arthashastra is connected to other Shastras, and unless these are all truly known, nothing is actually going to be accomplished. And if the king was to be fortunate enough to grasp the principles of Arthashastra, the first lesson that he would learn is not to trust one's wife and child. The other lesson he would learn is to measure out everything, including rice and firewood. He further tells the king what a vain, sad, and exacting life it would be, one devoted to learning Arthashastra. So he goes on with Kautilya. So Kautilya says that in the first watch of the night, the king should actually spend his time receiving reports on revenue, defense, and expenditure. And here is the parody by Viharabhadra. A king on rising, when he has scarcely washed his mouth fully, must devote the first watch to the examination of receipts and expenditure, admitting a handful or half a handful of anything. And yet, even while he hears, the clever superintendents will defraud him of twice as much. By the force of their own ingenuity, they multiply 1,000-fold the 40 modes of defrauding set forth by Chanakya. Having thus parodied Kautilya's advice, Viharabhadra goes on to tell the king, surely, your majesty, you've got all this, an exalted pedigree, unfaded youth, a lovely body, and immeasurable prosperity. Don't you therefore render all these advantages vain by attention to statecraft, which is the source of all mistrust, an impediment in the way of enjoyment of pleasures, and which is never without uncertainty on account of its having recourse to various kinds of tricks. So you can see that there is a very lively debate going on about the benefits and downside of engaging in a study of politics. Now, one would actually relate to this aversion if one looked at the vast corpus that comprised of the Arthashastra lore. So a common fear regarding knowledge acquisition is that one might grow old just studying, forgetting to live well in the bargain. This fear is particularly accentuated with respect to politics, which both in the sense of acquiring wealth and establishing a just order requires timely action rather than endless cogitation. In the Shanti Parva of the Mahabharata, Bhishma details how a massive treatise of 100,000 chapters on dharma, artha, and kama, composed by Brahma, was, thank God, studied and abridged by divine editors, starting with Shiva and Indra, until it was condensed to 1,000 chapters. Bhishma explains helpfully that this abridgment was necessary given the period of men's lives and the general degrees of everything. The tension between the comprehensive urges of knowledge acquisition and the short lives of mortals, and even the shorter windows of opportunity for political action, already announced in this originary moment, gets repeated often. Kautilya in the Arthashastra reassures us that his own text is a compendium of all the Arthashastras of ancient teachers. Following an elaborate listing of contents of the 14 books, he closes the first chapter claiming that his work, comprising only 15 books, 150 chapters, 180 topics, and 6,000 stanzas, is, if you please, bereft of undue enlargement, easy to grasp and understand, and composed in words the meaning of which has been definitively settled. So given these abridgments, and given the kind of vast corpus that we are talking about, it's not surprising that a lot of young people were averse to learning or engaging with the Arthashastra. This predicament is actually wonderfully elaborated in the frame story of the Panchatantra, where the three sons of Amara Shakti, Bahu Shakti, Ugra Shakti, and Ananta Shakti have set their faces against learning. And the king is in search of a tutor who would actually spark their interest in learning. And so when he convenes a meeting with the Council of Ministers, many of them again tell him that it only takes 12 years to learn grammar, after which one has to study the laws and treatises on statecraft for the mind to truly shine. I want to leave this at that. I want to go on now to how Vishnu Sharma, who rises to the occasion in Panchatantra and takes on the challenge of turning these three powerful princes to the love of wisdom, how he then goes on to give us the work that we today call Panchatantra, composes it. And if you look at the 5 tantras, in the description of the 5 tantras, they are as follows. The first tantra in Panchatantra is Mitra Bheda, the separation of friends. The second one is Mitra Prapti, the acquisition of friends. The third one is Kakulikiyam, which is a story of the crows and the owls, but it's actually about war and peace. And the fourth is loss of gains, and the fifth is Aparikshita Karakam, which is rash deeds. One wonders, what is the connection between tutoring people in the art of politics or the art of ruling here and friendship? Because the bulk of Panchatantra is devoted to actually cultivating the young people in the art of cultivating them and tuning them to the art of friendship. Now, in Panchatantra, you have Damanaka, who, when posed with this question, helpfully tells his interlocutor, Karataka, that one must study politics and one must engage in politics because politics is about helping friends and harming enemies. Of course, this would raise a lot of questions. Does Damanaka really know to distinguish between friends and enemies? And we find that Damanaka is actually a courtier, a hereditary courtier who's been sidelined by the king Pingalaka and is waiting for a way to worm his way back into the court. And we get then Vishnu Sharma in this elaborate first book called Mitra Bheda, telling us about a noble aristocratic Pingalaka, the Lion King, who is supposed to be beaming with sheer pride, ruling without any pomp and show, possessing indomitable courage and honor, and shining with an innate majesty and having an uncommon appetite for power. This is from the Chandra Rajan translation of the Panchatantra. And the Lion King is one morning rooted to the ground, hearing huge thundering bellows from it doesn't know who. And Damanaka decides to investigate the matter. And this story, I'm picking on the story because I'm hoping that this is a story that many of you in the audience would be familiar with. And Damanaka investigates, finds that the source of this thunderous bellowing is actually a bull abandoned by the owner. And he then engineers a friendship between Pingalaka and Damanaka, thereby once again coming back into the court and winning the king's favor. Now we find that in no time, this friendship between the bull Sanjeevaka, translated as lively by Chandrarajan, and Pingalaka, tawny, blossoms. And here I read from the description of this friendship. Now, lively Sanjeevaka possessed great intelligence and had developed profound wisdom, having studied and mastered various branches of learning. He spent much time instructing Pingalaka, so that in a short while, even a blockhead like the king of beasts became wise and intelligent. The two friends were so close that they spent all their time together, talking and discussing between themselves in private and unattended. Lacking the strength of the lion and his skill in hunting and foraging, the animal community, including our two jackals, were unable to forage for themselves as needed. So left out in the cold, Damanaka then sows dissension between Sanjeevaka and Pingalaka, leading, of course, to the assassination of the bull. Now, when we begin to wonder what exactly was it that transpired between Pingalaka and Sanjeevaka, what is the kind of learning that was so captivating that the Lion King was turned away from the business of ruling and acquisition, and in the process, he alienated these ministers who were dependent on him. Now, Vishnu Sharma doesn't give us any clue as to what exactly was the content of the conversation, but we do get to hear from Damanaka about Rajniti, and Rajniti being oriented to expediency and opportunism. So when Pingalaka, after killing the bull, is somewhat remorseful, then we have Damanaka articulating one particular version of Rajniti that comes up in all these texts that I've picked up, which is Rajniti as realpolitik, as unsentimental power play. And so here we have Damanaka, who consoles the Lion King and then describes in the process the actual nature of political knowledge. He says, the policy of princes is protean, assuming many forms, appearing true but actually false, appearing sweet but often harsh, appearing compassionate but really cruel, and so on. He reminds the Lion King that there's nothing wrong with slaying a traitor foe, and that a state cannot be governed by norms and nature, by the norms of commoners. We find throughout, of course, when he's trying to alienate the bull and when he's trying to cut down the friendship between the lion and the bull, he's playing on this idea that the Lion King has actually elevated a stranger. He's made friendship with someone who's unequal, and this runs through the Panchatantra. So what kind of friends should we make? What kind of friends should people in power actually look out for and cultivate? Should it be only friendships with equals? In the Telugu and the Sanskrit versions, we find that both Sanjeevaka, when he's disenchanted with the Lion King, and Damanaka, very clearly, when he's engaged in sowing dissent, is actually, they're both spouting this idea, which is conventional wisdom, that one must make friends with equals. Samana dhanam, samana balam, and so on. These keep coming up. But this is really not the last. And in fact, this theme is also at the center of Ashay Naik's book called Natural Enmity, which looks at book 1 of the Panchatantra. And there he says that there can be really no friendship between grass eaters and meat eaters, and that this is the major lesson of Panchatantra. But I tend to differ, because if you go on further into the Panchatantra, in book 2, this theme is picked up once again. And there we have, again, a friendship between a mouse, a deer, a turtle, and a crow, all of who initially are sort of not inclined to become friends. In fact, in the conversation between the mouse Hiranyaka and the crow Laghu Patanaka, or light wing, we find that there is some amount of discussion about equality and friendship. And the crow keeps beseeching the mouse, you are so wise and you must become my friend. And the mouse keeps repulsing, saying that there can be no friendship between natural enemies and between predators and prey. But at the end of this long interchange between the crow and the mouse, we find that friendship with people who come hailing us, particularly strangers who come hailing, this is something that is attractive and it cannot be set aside. So conventional wisdom about friendship and equality is not given the last word in the Panchatantra. We also find that the sheer joys of friendship, which is of sharing stories and sharing wit and wisdom, tends to loom large throughout the Panchatantra. And it appears that people who are going to be in politics, whether as rulers or as courtiers or as counselors, must actually be exposed to these joys of friendship in order for them to judge and to discern between friends and enemies. How much time would you like me to speak, Kinnera? Because I don't want to take away. You're on mute.
Yeah. I thought you would just set the basic background and then we will have a conversation. I'll ask you a couple of questions.
Okay.
So if you've concluded this, I can continue.
Would you like, yeah, I can actually stop here, or I can just say a few more things about what are the other themes in the book, or?
Yeah, conclude the themes and then we'll come back to the questions.
All right. So I then pursue this idea through these texts of what constitutes practical wisdom and how various teachers or experts in Rajniti are trying to cultivate practical wisdom in their pupils, in their students, and so on. So I want to now move to Dasakumara Charita, which actually seems like a strange text to pick up many of you may by now have understood why Panchatantra and Hitopadesha actually fit in. But if you know about Dasakumara Charita and Vikram and Vetal's cycle of stories, you might be wondering, what was she doing with these texts? And
in fact, that was one of my questions, actually.
Yeah. Okay, go ahead. So ask your question and maybe then I can respond.
No, just quickly sum up the other themes.
Yeah,
and then,
okay. So the Dasakumara Charita, interestingly, is about cultivating and tuning the erotic desires of 10 princes, but we only have 8 stories which are available. And we find there that it is actually, as Daud Ali has put it, the erotic palette provides a canvas wherein a detection of concealed feelings, figuring out the strategies of others, artful use of deception. So all these things which are part of the affiliative dynamics of court cultures are being projected and reflected upon. So here we have in Dasakumara Charita a courtesan, Kama Manjari, who is adept at the art of deception, but also she's such a connoisseur of the rasa, the Shringara rasa, that she's able to play at it without being too attached. We find a thief, Apahara Varman, who's actually also been shown as someone adept at acquiring wealth, but not very attached to using that wealth for his own comfort and his own life. So we find throughout the Dasakumara Charita a close interconnection between tutoring these princes in what we would think are strange ways of being tutored in the art of love, in the art of thievery, in the art of gambling, and so on. But at the end of Dasakumara Charita, we have a long discourse on statecraft, very clearly referring back to and having a conversation with Kautilya's Arthashastra. So I move finally to Vikram and Vetal, where I find that, again, the focus is on ethical education of the sovereign and tuning the sovereign to recognize ethical excellence from unlikely and unexpected agents. In one case, it is a robber. In another case, they call him a serpent youth, but perhaps a marginalized youth from a tribal community. And while tutoring King Vikramaditya to recognize ethical excellence from all these unlikely or unexpected sources, at the same time, we find that the Vikram and Vetal cycle, particularly the Shivadasa rendition that I have relied on, is also trying to alert the king to the limits of practicing that kind of ethical excellence in his own business, which is the art of ruling. Because at the end of that cycle of stories, if you know the Vikram and Vetal series, there are 24 stories, and he has to figure out who is the nobler or greater hero in each one of these, well, in 5 stories that I have picked up. And we find that paramount sovereignty of King Vikramaditya paradoxically would involve, at the very end, fratricide. And so we wonder, what's the connection between training him to judge ethical excellence and also getting him to perform this horrific deed to maintain his own power? So I want to close there, and thank you once again for being here and for listening.
Yeah. Actually, some of these are again going to be repeated in my question, so you'll have to bear with me for that. My first question is, your 3 books, they focus on ethics, conscience, and virtue, and you teach political science. Given that the ephemeral values of ethics and virtue have fast disappeared or are disappearing in most places in our world today, I mean, the world over, you can't just say in one place, how does this discussion on virtue remain germane to the political discourse today?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's why the texts I pick up in this book happen to be texts which are center staging political necessity. Realpolitik runs through all these texts. And still, I want to retrieve the concern that these authors have with rescuing a principled kind of expediency. So they don't deny that politics will involve focusing on what is expedient. They don't deny that politics will involve a lot of dark deeds. But and I think that's the maturity I find in some of these pre-modern classics. That founding order and overcoming disorder sometimes will require very dark deeds, which are not spoken about, excepting in esoteric political thought. And these authors are sensitive to that without then simply going off to the other extreme and saying that politics is only about being crooked and politics is only about being following expediency. So my interest in Rajgopalachari was also to retrieve a kind of principled flexibility that I think he was adept at. And the same theme runs through the other book that you talked about.
Okay. I'd like to quote from your book, undoubtedly, there was a vibrant tradition of discussion on the nature, scope, and uses of Niti Shastra. We may be justified in wondering whether and how this expert knowledge was taught, transmitted, criticized, and modified. While Kautilya's treatise is full of references to experts and their contrarian views, literary texts like Panchatantra and Dashakumara Charita center stage the skepticism regarding expert knowledge with great irony and humor. It appears that the theory-practice dichotomy was often voiced then as it is now, and compelled teachers to distill and transmit their wisdom in easily accessible and jazzy formats. So my question is, storytelling as a tool for holding the attention and engaging the mind of persons who are eager to act and be at the forefront of power and change, especially in today's highly reduced attention span, is a huge challenge. So how do we do this and still maintain the seriousness of scholarly discourse?
I think one of the ways to do it is to return people to reading the classics. I mean, I think what's happened now is, so in order to research, while doing research for this book, I read all of the Amar Chitrakatha comics on Panchatantra and Hitopadesha and so on. And I found that somehow they seem to think that this is only about a kind of didactics. So there is no discussion, which should, I think, happen at the level of higher education. So, of course, we have to teach them to be honest and to be charitable and to be generous and to be hardworking and so on, which is how the Amar Chitrakatha and other series sort of render these stories. But I think at higher levels, when we pick up these classics, that is when there can be a more discursive engagement with some of these virtues and values. Will it be a mixture of, as they call, blended mode? Will it be partly storytelling, partly picking up proverbs? And I think that's why I think reading the Panchatantra is very rewarding, because the moral argumentation there is not of the kind that we are doing in the classrooms now, which is always directing them to these scholarly articles, right? I think narrative intelligence, which is setting forth in front of them situations where people are actually confronted with these choices and must judiciously act, I think that's the way to go. And so we must read more stories, and like they say, multidisciplinary. So maybe we'll have to incorporate more of those tools in our teaching and learning.
Yeah, and actually we don't revisit the stories beyond our childhood. I think, and I don't even think they are included in the liberal arts curriculum later. I mean, right now there's a move to bring in liberal arts to all disciplines, but I don't think this is happening. That was my question. You have already answered part of this question, but I would like you to elaborate a little bit more. I would like you to tell us why you chose the text that you actually chose. As listed by you in your book, there are several classics in ancient Indian texts. that can be discussed. It is understandable that you avoided a direct discussion on Arthashastra, as it is more in the nature of a prescriptive manual on strategy. For the same reason, maybe we don't discuss Mahabharata too. However, you have chosen both Panchatantra and Hitopadesha, which, well, not exactly copy-paste, but they are, however, similar. And in a similar context, you have Vetala Panchavimshati and the Salabhanjika stories, which are similar, but you chose to discuss only Vetala in detail. So I was not able to understand when Panchatantra and Hitopadesha are so very close and you chose to discuss both in great detail, whereas in Vetala and Salabhanjika, you chose only Vetala. So I was wondering, what has been the basis of your choice for the theme that you wanted to bring out?
Yeah, I mean, I think on the face of it, almost all these texts that I chose are self-consciously styling themselves as Niti Shastra. So when I decided, the epics I kept out because I thought I'll do another one on the epics later. And with the Mahabharata, one really does not know where to begin and where to end.
Exactly.
And I think given the formidable corpus that we have in the epics, I thought that's for another book. But this time I was looking at some of the didactic manuals like Chanakya Niti and Niti Sara and so on. But there is no discussion there. You see, they're all in the form of straightforward verses in praise of specific virtues. But there's no discussion as happens in the narrative genre of why is this to be prized and what's the right way to act. I mean, you said Hitopadesha and Panchatantra. Actually, they're not copy-paste. You would be surprised that the Hitopadesha is a much more coherent political structure running through it. And unlike Panchatantra, which begins with Mitra Bheda, Hitopadesha begins with Mitra Prapti, which is acquiring friends. And then separation comes next. And then it has two books specifically titled War and Peace. And I was drawn to Hitopadesha because it center stages peace at the very end of the book. So all the five that I've chosen, Mudra Rakshasa is explicitly a political play. But as I started reading more and more of these texts, I realized that they were having a sustained conversation with Kautilya's Arthashastra, which we don't get actually anywhere else. Maybe someone in the audience who's more familiar with this can clarify, but I haven't found a long sustained discussion on many things which come up in Arthashastra, on the four upayas, on the Shadgunya, the six strategies, and so on. And the parodying in the course of discussion is actually what captivated me.
Yeah, that you do mention in the thing. In the Panchatantra and the Hitopadesha, and more so in Hitopadesha, just like you have just now emphasized, the importance of choosing the right advisors and balancing their advice is beautifully brought out. I mean, there is this guy who talks to all his five ministers, which have beautiful names, I must say. And then he chooses his own from among the councils. Even the names are chosen for the characters to convey the deep meanings. I think that your discussion of the Hitopadesha must be read by those aspiring to rule. Will it help if we can get such people to listen? And jokes apart, I'd like to you to tell our viewers a couple of salient points from the Hitopadesha.
I think two things that you just mentioned, Kinnera. One, two sets of discussions with counselors, which immediately and explicitly hark back to Arthashastra. You know, what is the right strategy? When a former enemy comes as a friend, should you kill him right away? Should you take him into your fold and try to get the secrets of the enemy? Should you? So, I mean, I think these are the strategies, which the discussions that come up in Arthashastra. And I think it's well worth our time to look at the similarities and differences in this context between Panchatantra and Hitopadesha. The other thing that I really like about Hitopadesha is the emphasis on Karya Siddhi, real success, consisting not in uncertain adventurism, not in hawkish kind of warmongering, but in forging peace and using mantra yuddha, which is intrigue, to actually forge peace between two kings, one of who is oriented to the counselor and the other one is resisting the good advice of the counselor. So yes, I think there's a lot to be learned about rulers, whether they hearken to the counselors, whether they don't, and under what conditions do they hearken, and so on. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's necessary to have good bureaucracy, I think. Okay.
So I don't explicitly say these things in the book because I think the readers will sort of draw their own inferences from, I thought, the subtle ways in which I hint at possibilities for our present reality. Yeah.
And the flow of discussion in your book is on, friends and enemies, followed by war and peace confabulations, and then by the intrigue and decadence of political power. And finally, talking what constitutes better virtue. Even there's a lot of argument. And I think that's one place I liked a lot when you talk about whether this was really the nobler virtue. So that's the first two, like the friends and enemies and war and peace, give several ideas to ponder on, in terms of allies and dealing with enemies and councils and everything. But the third, which is the Dashakumara Charita, gives a view of the baser elements of political connivance to the point of incredulousness and disgust. What can we glean from the discussion on Dasakumara Charita is something, you have mentioned certain things, but somehow for me, the entire thing was at a nadir, politics at a nadir. So that was surprising for me. So what do we glean from the discussion on Dashakumara Charita, if you can say in a few words?
2-3 things. One, I think on the face of it, Dandin is actually portraying for us the collapse of all order, particularly if you look at the last book, which is that of Anantavarman, and the kind of quick slide into complete anarchy and disorder that happens in the kingdom because of untutored desire in high places. And I think this is not something we are comfortable talking about today because we are highly individualistic when it comes to discussions about desire in general and erotic desire in particular. And I think political philosophers have consistently, if you even look at Plato's work, for instance, there's a whole fascinating dialogue called the Symposium, which deals with love and eros, right? Now, so among all the passions, political philosophers have been most struck by and wrestling with the recalcitrant nature of the erotic passion. And so I find that Dandin is also very interested in this and shows how the art of ruling will also require us to learn about the erotic passion and taming that passion and channeling that passion, right? That's one thing. The second thing is that, I find that Kama Manjari and Apahara Varman, the two prototypes we get in the most important and extraordinary book on how to acquire. So the two human ends, right? Acquiring love and acquiring wealth. In this case, of course, broadly wealth is connoting not just wealth as a material wealth, but also acquiring kingdoms. And we find that in the discussion of the acquisition of these two ends, the human ends, Dandin is actually telling us about the felicity that a courtesan has and the felicity that Apahara Varman, who's actually a prince playing at being a thief, has. And I kept wondering, so what could be the insight here? And like I say in the book, he's not going into religious sources, but he's simply telling us so the term that comes up in the discussion is how eros and ruling are both games of chance and strife. And I really like that that phrase, games of chance and strife, the more you reflect on it, the more you'll see that this, in fact, is the essence of the acquisition of kama and artha. And it captures the absolute core of kama and artha. And a courtesan and someone playing at a thief, I think these two also tell us about detachment. So a skillful player plays not so much to win, but plays for the sheer joy of playing. And we find that Kama Manjari, the courtesan par excellence, is the one who's totally detached. She can get anybody to fall in love with her, but she herself transcends the attachment, right? And so is Apaharavarman. So that's the second thing that struck me about Dasakumara Charita. And the final thing is, if you look at the last book of the Dasakumara Charita, we have somebody who has, as you said, stooped to murder, deceit, impersonation in order to restore the rightful heir to the kingdom. But even he, I think, at the very end, seeks to be judged kindly. And I think Dandin and Mudra Rakshasa, that is Vishakadatta, as well as I think Shivadasa in Vikram and Vetal's stories, are telling us something very esoteric and very difficult for us to grapple with, which is, how do we judge expediency and opportunism in the service of restoring order? Because politics at root for these authors is about restoring order. Right? So,
in fact, my next question was on Kama Manjari herself. This interesting anecdote of Kama Manjari and her discourse on dharma, artha, and kama, that was extremely interesting. You then go on to discuss about the status of women, and I like your analysis there, and the active roles they played in society and politics. But is niti in the case of women not justified as it is done for men? In Dasakumara Charita, several transgressions of men are justified in the name of statecraft. But in the case of women, it does not appear so.
yeah, I mean, I can only defend these texts to an extent. I do see that many of these texts, as you probably noticed when you read through that, there are the patriarchal biases which creep in. But I still think that Dandin, for instance, in the quartet of stories he tells us about women's virtue, is actually mocking the conventional standards of what is expected of a wife. So I think there are glimmers, because these are very, very astute and intelligent composers and authors. And I think they mark it and they question it, but in a very subtle sense. So I really like that. If you remember the quartet where I talk about the four women, the one woman of superlative pativratahod,
Yes.
the one who's able to virtually serve a 5-course meal out of nothing, basically, and forgive a philandering husband and so on. And Dandin is actually laughing at that whole prototype. And then you have at the very end another story where she's artfully managing appearances while undermining pativratahod. So I think there is a glimmer.
And still maintaining the image of pativratahod.
Yeah. But I mean, but don't forget that when you have Visruta in the last book of the Dasakumara Charita, actually getting the queen to use her image of being a pativrata for political purposes, I find that that's something, that's where I think the mockery is at its peak, and the complete instrumental use of these appearances are at their peak. Yeah.
I just have a couple of more questions, then we'll take audience questions. You do refer to ancient Greek or European texts, but there are other older civilizations too which had great texts, I mean, for example, Chinese or any other one. So any reason why you looked only at Greek classics as for comparison?
Yeah, because my training in political philosophy began with Western political thought, as I think many of us are probably familiar with. We begin with Western philosophy or Western political thought. So I was trained by people to read Aristotle and Machiavelli and the literary works of Machiavelli and various others I refer to in the book carefully. So of course, I engage in what I call reciprocal questioning. So I go from one set of texts to another set, and then I keep going back and forth without being inhibited by historicism or any other kind of charge that might be leveled against me. And I think that's the advantage of being in political philosophies. You can transgress some of these boundaries and go back and forth. That's what I do. I don't know if I succeeded in putting to rest the charges of being a historical or being Orientalist and so on. That's for readers to judge. Yeah.
Okay, you have assiduously avoided any reference to modern political events, and frankly, I don't blame you. That's a thing good to steer away from that. However, there's one odd reference to the Kargil War. Any particular reason you chose to emphasize that in isolation?
No, I think, I'm sorry, but I think every now and then as writers, we will ask ourselves, and sometimes I think that was also because a student who was proofreading that chapter said, what's the connection? And I think to fulfill her question, I may have put in a couple of sentences, but I steer away, as you know, from direct kinds
it stood out for me. When I was reading the entire
yeah.
book, it stood out for me. So I just wondered why.
Okay.
And in your opinion, the experience, in your opinion and experience, has the new emphasis on liberal arts education made any headway? And how do you think it should be taught? We did discuss a little bit of it. For example, history with names and dates is of least value unless the mitigating circumstances of society and economy are discussed. So how should we go about it? This I've always found, history can be so interesting, but we make it so very drear. So I was just wondering how you go about it.
My own sense, I can't talk about history, but I can talk about political thought. And increasingly, I think when we teach Indian political thought, we tend to focus on contemporary and modern Indian political thinkers, and we seldom look into the pre-modern material. So I think, I think we must focus much more on the pre-modern material, if only to get some distance from the routine questions that preoccupy us. So we are preoccupied with secularism and we are preoccupied with nationalism and so on. But I do think that if we can, sometimes we also should distance ourselves from these routine preoccupations, and then we get another window through these pre-modern classics to look at what I think are enduring political questions. For instance, how do you get people in positions of power to be friendly to learning? I think this is to be friendly to political wisdom. And I think this in general is applicable across fields, not just in politics, but it's particularly troubling when this happens in politics. So I think those are the kinds of themes that interested me. I have dealt, it's not true that I don't deal with contemporary Indian politics. In the Rajgopalachari book, at least post-independent Indian politics looms large. But for this book, I steer away from any direct discussion.
Okay, from my side, I'll ask one last question because we have to have time for viewers' questions. You appear to have a 5-year plan for your book publications. Are you going to surprise us with a book earlier than 2025?
I have no idea. I'm thinking of some things. I have been doing a lot of work on surveillance and privacy, which is my other interest in technology and politics, but I don't know. I don't have any plan as of now. Yeah.
Okay, there's a question from Ramakrishna Dulam. As personal is political, life cannot be devoid of some sort of political ideologies, and literature is artistic expression of life. And then he also continues to say, is it true to say that all literature, not only Panchatantra et al., can be studied through the prism of politics?
Yeah, I distinguish between the ideological approach and what he calls politics. I think when we're thinking of ideologies, we tend to be reductionist. We look at Panchatantra and we say, what kind of society could it be representing and what kind of history is it representing and so on. And there can be ideological interpretations of these texts. After all, they arose in what one might today call feudal contexts, and they're talking about monarchical regimes and so on. But I deliberately steer away from ideological readings because, as I said, I think there are enduring political questions. And my interest was to excavate some of those enduring political themes.
Okay. Sudarshanam Padam sends me a message on my phone about the place of women. Recently, Arabian Nights has been rewritten, restoring the place of women. Can we have a recall at our classics in this context?
Yes, certainly. I think rendering them from a woman's standpoint or even a feminist standpoint is certainly possible. Like I said, there are glimmers where we find that the conventional expectations of women are being mocked and questioned. So there is a possibility. There are also many, many stories where it appears that women are also having debates on what are the right kinds of virtues. And not all those virtues would be the same as the virtues which are being highlighted by the male protagonists. So certainly it's possible, but it's not one that I'm equipped to do.
Actually, Manu Pillai was talking about some feminist historians who are writing about history from the perspective of the feminist viewpoint. And I think that he says that there's a tremendous amount of interesting work being done there. I think maybe that's definitely required, especially in our thing, because if you look at all the Indian classics, women have played a role in politics as well as society. Whether you take Kunti with her strategies or Draupadi with her strategies, they have played a significant role in the way the study, the whole plot developed. Or you take many others as well. If you see that, then women have really done a tremendous amount. Now, these are not written from the women's perspective, and I think some kind of rewriting should also happen.
I have no reservations on that. I fully endorse that. And one wonders what would happen if we looked at some of the stories in Vikram and Vetal series, like I talk about Madana Sena, why she's not being picked up as excelling in virtue.
Yes.
So yes, I think there are moments where we see that all these authors are simply affirming conventional stereotypes which ignore women's virtues and which ignore and neglect the ethical excellence of women, certainly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, even Shankaracharya engaged with women. I mean, he had no qualms about engaging with women. Which only talks about that there was a lot of intellectual discourse where women were participating in, and I think that needs to be brought to the fore. Any other questions, Siddhika? I can't see questions. There are only messages saying that it was a good discussion. Lakshmi Kannan, Deepak Panchanda, and then, they're saying it's a good one. Rajan Harshya is saying it's good. Okay, those are compliments, but any other questions now?
No, ma'am.
Okay. So, I would like to have a message for our viewers. As you're aware, our annual festival is always conducted during the 4th week of January. Our 12th edition of annual Hyderabad Literary Festival will be held digitally on the 28th, 29th, and 30th of January 2022. Please do not miss it. We have an exciting array of literary sessions, poetry, exhibitions, storytelling, workshops, stage talks, cultural events, films, and more. And leading up to the festival, we have a pre-event coming up on 8th January, an e-mushaira. Please note that this is on a Sunday at 6 p.m. I would now like to thank Vasanthi for her interesting book and discussion, which we all enjoyed listening to. Thank you very much for spending your time with us and enlightening us with the nuances of political thought in our ancient texts. It was a very well spent evening. And I hope that you enjoyed talking to us as much as we did listening to you. Thank you, Vasanthi.
Thank you so much, Kinnera. Same here. It was a delight.
Yeah. And to our viewers again, please tune in again at 6 p.m. on 8th January. Till then, season's greetings from all of us and a very